For decades, there has been one sentence that followed Linux everywhere like a shadow. Yeah, Linux is great, but you still need Windows. You needed Windows for work. You needed Windows for gaming. You needed Windows for that one app your company refuses to replace. You needed Windows just in case. And that idea became so deeply rooted that even many Linux users accepted it as a fact of life. Dual boot, keep a spare Windows machine. Run a Windows VM, because Linux, no matter how good it got, was always treated as incomplete. But something has quietly changed, and most people haven't noticed it yet. Linux didn't just get faster or prettier or more stable. Linux crossed a threshold, and once you see it, the idea that Windows is still required starts to fall apart. This isn't about one magical update or one single patch in the kernel. This is about a convergence, a moment where multiple technologies matured at the same time and locked into place. And together, they did something that Linux has been trying to do for over 20 years. Remove Windows from the dependency chain entirely. Not replace it by force, not emulate it badly, not beg software vendors for ports, but make it optional to the point of irrelevance. Let's start with the biggest psychological barrier. Applications. The number one reason people say they can't leave Windows is simple. My apps won't run. For years, that was a fair argument. Wine was fragile. Compatibility was hit or miss. One update could break everything, and the idea of running professional or commercial Windows software on Linux felt like a science experiment. Today, that world is gone. What replaced it is something far more dangerous to Windows than a native Linux app ever was, a compatibility layer that users don't even think about anymore. Proton didn't just change Linux gaming, it changed expectations. It taught millions of users that Windows software can run on Linux well enough that you stop asking whether it's native. You just click, install, and play. That mindset has now spilled far beyond games. Wine itself has matured into a stable, predictable platform. Commercial tools, productivity software, creative apps, even niche utilities that never had a Linux version are running reliably on modern Linux systems. And the most important part is not performance or compatibility percentages. It's convenience. You no longer feel like you're fighting the system to make Windows apps work. They just work often enough that Windows stops being the safe choice. At the same time, Linux native applications have quietly closed the gaps people used to point at. Office work is no longer tied to a single operating system. Whether it's LibreOffice, only Office, or browser-based tools, the practical difference for most users is gone. Creative workflows that once demanded Windows or Mac OS now exist fully on Linux. Video editing, audio production, graphic design, even 3D work are no longer fringe cases. The idea that Linux is only for servers and programmers is completely detached from reality. But many people still believe it because they haven't looked in years. Then there's gaming, the final boss of Linux adoption. For a long time, Windows survived purely because of games. Even users who loved Linux kept Windows installed for one reason, just for gaming. That excuse is evaporating. Not because every game runs perfectly, but because enough games run well enough that the trade-off no longer makes sense. Modern Linux systems can handle AAA titles, competitive online games, indie releases, emulators, and entire libraries of older Windows games. And the experience keeps improving without the user doing anything. You update your system, and compatibility improves. That's the opposite of how things used to be. But here's where the real shift happens, and where the title of this video stops being clickbait and starts being uncomfortable for Windows. The feature that changes everything isn't flashy. It doesn't come with a logo or a launch event. It's the fact that Linux is now a complete host operating system for everything else, Windows included. And when Windows becomes something you run inside Linux, instead of the other way around, the power dynamic flips completely. Virtualization on Linux is no longer a niche tool for sysadmins. It's fast, integrated, and accessible. You can run Windows in a virtual machine with near-native performance. You can isolate it, snapshot it, back it up, freeze it in time, and throw it away when you're done. You don't need Windows to manage your computer anymore. You use Windows as a tool, like an application. And when Windows becomes an application, it stops being required. This matters more than people realize. Because the biggest reason Windows has stayed dominant isn't that people love it. It's that Windows has been the default foundation. You build everything on top of it. Linux just became a better foundation. It's more stable, more transparent, more customizable, and more secure by design. And once Linux is your base layer, everything else becomes optional. Hardware support used to be another excuse. Linux doesn't support my hardware. That argument aged badly. Modern Linux kernels support an absurd range of devices out of the box. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, graphics, audio, webcams, controllers, printers. In many cases, Linux now supports hardware faster than Windows does, and when it doesn't, the situation is usually temporary. The myth of Linux being hard to install or configure belongs to a different era. Today, installing Linux is often easier than installing Windows, especially on older machines. Speaking of older machines, Linux also quietly solved another problem Windows refuses to address: aging hardware. Windows keeps getting heavier. More background services, more telemetry, more forced updates, more resource usage. Linux went the opposite direction. It scaled. You can run a modern Linux system on hardware that Windows considers obsolete. That alone changes everything for millions of users around the world. When your choice is between buying a new computer just to satisfy Windows or installing Linux and getting years of life out of your current system, the answer becomes obvious. And then there's the web. The modern web doesn't care what operating system you use. Your bank doesn't, your email doesn't, your documents don't, your meetings don't. Most Windows-only workflows already live inside a browser, and Linux browsers are first-class citizens. Chrome, Firefox, Chromium, Brave, Edge, they all run perfectly. If your daily work happens in web apps, Windows adds nothing except overhead. Now, let's talk about control, because this is where Linux truly breaks free from Windows entirely. With Windows, you don't own your system, you rent it. Updates happen when Microsoft decides, features appear and disappear, settings move or vanish. Ads show up in the interface you paid for. Telemetry runs, whether you want it or not. On Linux, the relationship is reversed. You decide. You choose when to update. You choose what runs. You choose how your system looks, behaves, and evolves. Once someone experiences that level of control, going back to Windows feels restrictive in a way that's hard to explain until you feel it yourself. Security is another silent shift. Linux isn't magically immune to problems, but its model is fundamentally different. The permission system, the package management, the way software is distributed all reduce entire classes of issues that Windows users consider normal. You don't download random installers from the internet. You don't stack antivirus on top of a broken trust model. You update your system from one place, and everything updates together. Once people get used to that, Windows starts to feel chaotic. And this is where the real change becomes impossible to ignore. Linux no longer asks, "Can I replace Windows?" Linux simply exists without it. Windows is no longer the baseline. It's an option, a compatibility target, a guest. And that's a devastating shift for any platform that built its dominance on being unavoidable. Even Microsoft seems to understand this. They put Linux inside Windows with WSL because developers were leaving. But what's happening now is the inverse. People are putting Windows inside Linux because they don't want Windows controlling their machine anymore. That's not a technical detail. That's a philosophical reversal. So when we say Linux just got a feature that changes everything, what we really mean is that Linux reached escape velocity. It no longer needs permission, ports, or validation from Windows. It runs the software, plays the games, supports the hardware, and hosts the workflows. Windows, for the first time, is optional. And once an operating system becomes optional, it stops being required. Not for normal users, not for gamers, not for professionals, not even for businesses, many of which already run Linux everywhere except the desktop out of habit, not necessity. This doesn't mean Windows is dead. It means Windows lost its leverage, and that's far more important. If you're still running Windows because you think you have to, the truth might be uncomfortable. You probably don't. Linux isn't the future anymore. It's the present. And the quiet part is that it didn't need permission to get here. Windows is no longer required. And the moment you realize that, everything changes.